So this is screencast 2, and I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about information exchange and clarity with explaining medical conditions. So what do we mean by information exchange? There are going to be a range of times within a consultation where it's going to naturally fit into the conversation that there needs to be information exchange between yourself and your service user. It might be at the beginning. It might be that you want to explain to a service user about the role of a dietitian because they're not aware of it. It could be you're explaining about the service or how the consultation is going to go. It might be the explanation of diagnosis, which we're going to look at. It might be something to do with food and nutrition or some understanding of physiology that's really important to their understanding of their condition. There's a range of things that you might want to have an exchange of information with your service user to aid them in their decision making and their understanding of why their diet is going to be really important for their condition. So we have a process that we can go through which deals with these situations extremely well. So the process is known as EPPE. So firstly, we're going to elicit. We're going to find out what that service user already knows about that particular thing. So what do they understand so far? Tell me, what do you understand about the role of a dietitian? So we're trying to find out what they know. This is really important because then what you don't do is just start telling people what a dietitian does when they already know. So you're filling in the gaps rather than patronising anybody by just assuming they know nothing. But we also shouldn't assume that they know everything. So we've got to get that balance right. And the best way is to use this process. So what do they understand so far? Find out what they know. Then we want to ask permission to fill in that gap, knowledge gap. And bear in mind, people have a right to say no to this. Would it be useful for me to go over how diabetes affects blood sugar? That's just one example. Most often people are going to say, actually, yes, it would really help. Thank you. So we found out what they know. We asked permission to give them some information, and then we actually give them information. And we explain as much as possible in plain English, which isn't our natural way of speaking in work situations because we tend to make a lot of assumptions. We tend to use jargon. And occasionally we can slip into that trap of being quite persuasive and saying, "Cause if you follow the diet, you won't have any problems," which is untruthful. And not correct. So we need to be really mindful of how we say this, explain things. But I've heard a lot of people do this with diabetes in particular. You follow the diet and you'll be fine. No, diabetes is a progressive illness. So we need to be really careful that our attempts to put something into everyday language don't take away from the accuracy of what we're saying. And of course, the people you have in front of you are going to be very diverse. Some will require very simple explanations. Some will be able to understand at a greater depth. But the key thing is that you keep it in everyday English and don't make assumptions of what people already know. So we found out what they know. We asked permission to give them information. We then provide the information. And then we check how they have received that information, what their understanding is. Did it apply to them? So, what do you think of that information? Is there anything I've not made clear? We need to be careful not to say something simple like, was that useful? Or did you understand that? Because most people are going to say yes, because they don't want to admit that they didn't understand. They are assuming that the lack of understanding is their fault. And therefore they feel that, it's just their inadequacy that means they haven't understood something. And put yourself in this situation in lectures sometimes. Does anybody ever say anything that goes over your head and you're thinking, I don't get a clue? but you might not be the one who's got the courage to put your hand up and say, I'm sorry, I didn't understand that. Can you go over that again? So just put yourself in that position and think, right, how do I feel if something's being talked about and I don't understand it? Think how important this understanding is, because if people don't understand why losing weight is most often an appropriate treatment for type 2 diabetes, why would they want to lose weight? Maybe they already do, but maybe they don't. So we've got to try and make sure that we are getting that understanding and checking that they have understood, and be willing to go over it again if they haven't understood it. So let's think a little bit about providing information. So we need to avoid terms that are everyday to us. We've learned them, we use them in our assignments and in talking with each other. But if you tell someone they've got hypertension, what does that mean to them? If you talk about blood glucose, is that an everyday term? Insulin, what's that? Villi, what are they? If you haven't explained them first or checked that that service user understands them and can understand how it's relevant to them, you can lose them completely. And some terms that we use as well that we just assume people understand, like carbohydrates. What are carbohydrates? What are carbs? Often people shorten it and just say, your carb intake. Well, what is that? You and I know the answer to that question, but not everybody does. So making sure that people understand terms is really, really important. So unless you know that, actually the person in front of you is a nutrition lecturer, so yes, clearly they do understand what carbohydrates are. Another reason for finding out what people do for a living, it can give you a little bit of insight as to whether they're likely to understand or not. But just to give you an example, I had one of the consultants I worked with as a patient once because he had hypercholesterolemia. So he understood what hypercholesterolemia was, but he had not a clue about what that meant for his diet. So although I wasn't using everyday language for some of the physiology, I very much was when it talked about how that was going to impact on his dietary intake. So just think through and make sure you don't make assumptions about what people do or do not understand. So we pitch it to people's level, but no assumptions at all. And when you're thinking about how does that apply to that individual, we definitely need to be really clear that there's no assumptions made. And here's just some examples of alternative words. So instead of saying blood glucose, just say sugar in the blood. Glucose is a type of sugar. It's still accurate, but it's a more understandable term. Arteries, blood vessels makes a little bit more sense to people. Cardiac, why not use the word heart? Cholesterol, fats in the blood. Saturated fat, fats that are mostly found in animal-based foods. We might use the terms like they're hard at room temperature, something like that. Polyunsaturated fats, mostly plant-based, but also oily fish. So we're looking at things that are a little bit more everyday language. And if you're talking about celiac disease, for example, instead of talking about villi, draw them or use your fingers to give an example of what these finger-shaped bulges on the inside of the gut are and what they might be for. Why do we have to use gastrointestinal? Why not just say gut in the gut wall? People understand those terms. So think about the words that you're using. So in the session, we're going to be working on some explanations for these conditions in plain English. Type 2 diabetes, celiac disease, and malnutrition, and the need for nutritional support. I think most people think we need to be very careful with long-term conditions, but when you are a band 5, the majority of your work is going to be people with needing nutritional support. And we should be able to explain to them why they require nutritional support, what nutritional support is, what supplements are. We just say, if you say supplements to most people, they think of vitamin pills. So we've got to be really certain that we're using words that are going to help people to understand what things are and how that relates to their need for making dietary change. So have a think, if you've got a moment, to think about some of the words that are complex that you might use with explanation of these conditions. And we're going to do a little bit of work on those in the session.